At the reading of my husband's will, my daughter-in-law smiled before I even lost everything. And somehow, that smile hurt more than the words that followed. As per the amended will, the attorney said, adjusting his glasses under the soft glow of the recessed ceiling lights, all primary assets, including the residence and investment accounts, are to be transferred to Daniel Harper. I felt the air shift in that room before I even fully understood what he meant. My name wasn't just missing, it had been erased. The conference room sat on the 12th floor of a downtown Chicago law firm, all glass walls and polished oak, the kind of place Robert used to joke about when we were younger, saying he'd only ever step foot in one if he absolutely had to. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, feeling the smooth fabric of my navy coat against my skin, and kept my posture straight. Afross from me, Claire sat with her back perfectly aligned against the leather chair, her cream blouse pressed without a wrinkle, her diamond ring catching the late afternoon sunlight as if it had something to celebrate. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. That small, controlled smile on her lips said enough. I turned slightly toward my son. Daniel, I said quietly, keeping my voice steady. Did you know about this? He didn't answer right away. His phone lit up on the table beside him, a quick flash of blue, and he glanced at it before looking anywhere but at me. Mom, let's just hear everything first, he replied, his tone careful, like he was trying to keep something from spilling over. That was when I understood this wasn't a surprise to everyone in the room, just to me. The attorney continued reading, his voice even, professional, as if he were listing off office supplies instead of dismantling a life I had spent 42 years building. The house in Naperville, the retirement accounts, even Robert's vintage truck that he kept polished every Sunday morning in the driveway. One by one, they slipped away from me in clean, legal sentences. I reached for the paper copy in front of me, the one printed on thick ivory stock, and scanned the lines myself. The signature at the bottom stopped me. My name was there, but it didn't feel like mine. I traced it lightly with my fingertip, noticing the exaggerated curve in the E, the way the pen had pressed too hard at the end, leaving a slight indentation. I had signed my name thousands of times over the years, checks, school forms, birthday cards, and I had never written it like that. Claire shifted in her seat, crossing one leg over the other with deliberate ease. It was what Robert wanted, she said softly, finally speaking, her tone measured, almost gentle. He made that very clear before he passed. I lifted my eyes to meet hers. Then it's strange, I replied, just as calmly, that he never mentioned it to me. The room fell into a brief, tight silence. The hum of the air conditioning unit above us suddenly felt louder, filling the space between words. The attorney cleared his throat and continued, but I barely heard him. My attention stayed on that document, on that signature that didn't belong to me, and on the way Claire's smile had appeared before the reading even began, like she had known exactly how this would end. And as I sat there, still and composed in that polished office, one question settled quietly into my mind, sharper than anything the lawyer had said. If I didn't sign this, then who did? I did not argue with the lawyer, and I did not raise my voice, but I did one thing that shifted the ground beneath that table. I pulled the document closer, turned it slightly toward the light, and said, Mr. Reeves, could you tell me exactly when this amendment was signed? His pen paused midair. It was a small hesitation, the kind most people would miss, but I had spent decades reading people across kitchen tables and quiet conversations. According to our records, he replied carefully, the amendment was executed 3 months before Robert passed. 3 months. I let that number settle. Robert had still been driving himself to the hardware store back then, still insisting on mowing the lawn even when I told him to let the neighbor's boy handle it. He had been forgetful with small things, yes, but not with decisions like this. Not with something that would leave me without a home. I nodded once, as if I were simply following along, then glanced back down at the signature. The ink looked slightly faded compared to the rest of the document, almost as if it had been printed at a different time or handled differently. And this was signed in person? I asked. Claire shifted again beside Daniel, her heel tapping once against the carpet before going still. Evelyn, she said, her tone smooth but firmer now. This is all standard. There is no need to go through every little detail today. I turned my head toward her, meeting her gaze without raising my voice. I have spent 42 years in that house, I said. I think I am entitled to understand how I lost it. Daniel exhaled sharply, leaning forward with his hands clasped. Mom, please, he said, his voice lower now, more controlled. We can sort everything out later. Let us just get through this. There it was again, that quiet push to move past the part that mattered most. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the leather creak softly beneath me, and folded my hands. No, I said, not loudly, but clearly enough that the room stilled again. We will sort it out now. Mr. Reeves cleared his throat and adjusted the stack of papers in front of him. The signing was witnessed and notarized, he added. We have all the required documentation on file. Then I would like to see it, I replied. Another pause. This one longer. Claire's smile did not disappear, but it changed, tightening at the corners just enough to reveal something beneath it. The copies are archived, she said before the lawyer could answer. It will take time to retrieve them. I watched her carefully. That answer had come too quickly, as if she had been waiting for the question. I shifted my attention back to the document, and then to the small details around me, the kind people overlook when they are focused on the bigger picture. The paper in front of me was crisp, but the bottom edge showed a slight curl, as though it had been handled more than once. The date near the signature was printed in a slightly different shade of black than the rest of the text. It was subtle, but it was there. 3 months before he passed. I repeated, almost to myself, then looked back up at Mr. Reeves. Do your records show where this was signed? He hesitated again, then flipped through a few pages. At Robert's residence, he said. Your home. I felt something settle into place inside me. Not panic, not even anger, but a quiet alignment of facts that did not fit together the way they should have. 3 months before Robert died, I had not left that house for more than a grocery run and a doctor's appointment. I had been there every day, every single day, and no one had come to that house with legal documents without me knowing. I let a small breath out through my nose and reached for my handbag, opening it just enough to slide the copy of the will inside. That is fine, I said, my tone calm again, almost agreeable. We will review the notarized copy together. Daniel looked up at me then, finally meeting my eyes, and for a brief moment I saw something flicker there, something uncertain, something that had not been there when we walked into this room. Claire, however, leaned back in her chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap as if everything were already settled. And as I closed my handbag and rested it beside my chair, one detail pressed itself forward, sharper than all the rest. If this document was signed in my own home while I was there, then someone had either come in without my knowledge, or someone already inside that house had made sure I would never see it. I did not leave the building right away. Daniel and Claire walked out ahead of me, their voices low, blending into the muted sounds of the hallway, but I stayed behind just long enough to watch the conference room door close. Then I stepped out and followed at a slower pace, my heels tapping softly against the polished floor. By the time I reached the elevator, they were already inside. Claire stood closest to the panel, her hand hovering over the button for the lobby, while Daniel leaned back against the mirrored wall with his arms crossed. I stepped in without a word. The doors slid shut, and for a moment, all three of us were reflected back at each other in that narrow space, layered in glass and silence. Mom, Daniel said after a few seconds, his voice quieter now, almost careful. We can talk about this over dinner, okay? There is no need to make it bigger than it is. I looked at his reflection rather than turning toward him. It is already as big as it gets, I replied. It is my home. Claire let out a small breath through her nose, not quite a laugh, but close enough to carry meaning. Evelyn, you are not being pushed out, she said, her tone smooth again. We are just reorganizing things. It makes more sense this way. I turned then, meeting her eyes directly. For whom? I asked. She held my gaze for a second, then shifted it toward the closing numbers above the door. For the family, she said. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the lobby, and the doors opened onto the marble reception area. A security guard nodded as we stepped out, and I caught the faint smell of brewed coffee drifting from a small station near the entrance. It was an ordinary afternoon in every way except the one that mattered. Outside, the wind coming off Lake Michigan carried a chill, and Daniel immediately pulled his coat tighter. I will drive you home, he said, reaching into his pocket for his keys. I shook my head. No, I said. I brought my car. That was not entirely true. I had taken a rideshare that morning because I did not want to deal with downtown parking, but I needed a reason to separate from them. Claire tilted her head slightly, studying me. Are you sure? She asked. It is a long drive back to Naperville. I have been making that drive for years, I answered. I think I can manage. Daniel hesitated, then nodded once. Call me when you get back, he said, though the words sounded more like a habit than a request. I did not promise that I would. Instead, I adjusted the strap of my handbag on my shoulder and turned toward the street, letting them walk in the opposite direction toward the parking garage. I did not look back, but as I stepped onto the sidewalk, one memory rose to the surface, not as a distraction, but as a piece of something I had not understood until now. 3 months ago, Daniel had insisted on coming by the house on a Tuesday afternoon. I just want to check on a few things, he had said over the phone. Maybe help you organize Dad's paperwork. I had been in the kitchen at the time, standing over the sink, rinsing out a coffee mug. I have everything under control, I told him. You do not need to worry. It will not take long, he said. Claire might stop by later too. That part had caught my attention even then. Claire rarely came by during the day unless there was a holiday or a planned dinner. Still, I had agreed. That afternoon, Daniel arrived first. He walked through the house with a kind of restless energy, opening drawers, glancing at stacks of mail, asking where certain documents were kept. Where did Dad usually keep the important stuff? He asked at one point, leaning against the hallway wall near the painting that concealed the safe. I remember wiping my hands on a dish towel and answering without thinking. In the safe, I said. Same place it has always been. Claire arrived about 20 minutes later, carrying a small leather tote I had never seen before. She greeted me with a quick hug, her cheek cool against mine, then followed Daniel down the hallway as if she already knew where he was going. I stayed in the kitchen for a while, finishing up the dishes, listening to the low murmur of their voices from the other end of the house. At the time, it had felt like they were trying to help, trying to take some of the weight off me after Robert passed. I had even been grateful. Now, standing on that Chicago sidewalk with the wind tugging at my coat, I saw that afternoon differently. The way Daniel had asked about the safe, the way Claire had arrived with that bag, the way their voices had dropped when I got too close to the hallway. I reached into my handbag and touched the edge of the document I had taken from the office, feeling the slight curl of the paper beneath my fingers. 3 months ago, they had been in my house, asking the right questions, moving through my space with quiet purpose. And if that was the same week this amendment was supposedly signed, then whatever happened did not begin in that conference room today. It began in my home. On a Tuesday afternoon I had almost forgotten. By the time I reached my house in Naperville, the sun was already dipping low behind the neighboring roofs, casting long shadows across the driveway Robert used to keep spotless every Sunday morning. I stood there for a moment before going inside, my hand resting on the cold metal of the front door handle, letting the silence settle around me. Then I stepped in, closed the door behind me, and walked straight down the hallway without turning on a single light. The painting was still there, hanging slightly off-center like it always had, a quiet little imperfection Robert never bothered to fix. I reached behind it, entered the code, and waited for the soft click of the safe unlocking. Everything inside looked neat at first glance. Too neat. I pulled out the folders one by one, setting them carefully on the console table. Insurance papers, old tax returns, the deed to the house. But the folder Robert had labeled for Evelyn was still missing. In its place, there was something else I did not remember putting there, a thin manila envelope with no label. I frowned slightly and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a notarization record. My name was printed at the top. The date matched exactly what Mr. Reeves had said in the office. 3 months before Robert passed. I held the page closer to the lamp I had just switched on, scanning every line. The notary's name, Linda Carver. Commission number, County of DuPage. It looked official, complete, legitimate. But there was one detail that did not belong. The address listed for the signing location was not mine. It was close, just 1 digit off in the street number, but it was not my house. I read it again to be sure. Then a third time. My pulse did not spike, and my hands did not shake. Instead, something steadier took hold, something that felt like the beginning of control. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, dialing the number printed under the notary's name. It rang twice before a woman answered. Linda Carver speaking. Her voice was brisk, professional. Ms. Carver, I said, keeping my tone even. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am reviewing a document that lists you as the notary. I just need to confirm something. There was a brief pause on the line. All right, she said. What do you need? I glanced back down at the paper. Do you recall notarizing a will amendment for a Robert Harper about 3 months ago? Silence. Not long, but long enough. Then I heard the faint sound of paper shuffling on her end. I would. Need to check my logbook, she replied. I keep records of every signing. Do you have the exact date? I gave it to her. Another pause, longer this time. I walked slowly into the living room, past the couch where Robert used to sit with his coffee every morning, and stopped by the window. That is strange, she said finally. I do have an entry for that date, but the name is different. It is not Robert Harper. I did not speak right away. I let her finish. And the address listed in my log, she added, does not match what you just told me. I was at a small office building in Lyle that afternoon, not a private residence. I closed my eyes for a brief second, not in shock, but in confirmation. So you are certain, I said, that you did not notarize any document for Robert Harper at my home? I am certain, she replied. If it is not in my logbook, I was not there. I thanked her and ended the call, lowering the phone slowly. The house was quiet again, but it felt different now, like the walls were holding on to something that had been hidden in plain sight. I looked down at the notarization record in my hand, then at the open safe behind me, then at the empty space where Robert's folder should have been. The amendment had been presented as clean, legal, unquestionable. But now there was a discrepancy, small, precise, and impossible to ignore. The wrong address, the wrong name in the log. A notary who had never been in my house. I walked back to the console table, placed the paper flat, and smoothed it out with my palm. Claire had said everything was standard. Daniel had asked me to wait, to let it pass. But this was not standard. This was constructed. And if the notarization itself did not match reality, then the question was no longer whether something had been changed. It was how far they had gone to make it look real. I picked up my phone again, this time scrolling through my call history until I found Daniel's name, my thumb hovering just above it. For a moment, I considered calling him right then, asking him directly what he had done in my house that afternoon. But I stopped myself. Not yet. Because if this document was not what they claimed it was, then confronting him too soon would only give him time to prepare an answer. I set the phone down instead and looked back at the paper one more time, my mind already moving ahead, connecting the pieces that had not fit before. The safe, the missing folder, the visit 3 months ago, and now, a notarization that never actually happened where they said it did. Which meant the next step was no longer about what I suspected, but about what I could prove. And the only way to do that was to find out exactly who had been in this house with them that afternoon, and what they had brought with them. The next morning, the pressure arrived before I even had time to finish my coffee. I was standing at the kitchen counter, the same spot where Robert used to read the newspaper, when my phone buzzed against the granite surface. Daniel's name lit up the screen. I let it ring once more than usual before answering. "Good morning, Mom," he said, his tone overly casual, like he was stepping into a conversation that had not just shifted the ground beneath my life. I wanted to check in. Claire and I were talking last night, and we think it would be best to start making some arrangements for the house. I did not respond right away. Instead, I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth settle before I spoke. "What kind of arrangements?" I asked. There was a brief pause. Then he continued, more directly now. "We are planning to list it. The market is strong right now, and it does not make sense to wait. Claire has already reached out to a realtor." I set the mug down carefully. The sound of ceramic against granite was soft, but deliberate. "Already?" I asked. "That was quick." "We just want to be proactive," he replied. "And it would help if you could start going through your things. Maybe decide what you want to keep." There it was. Not a suggestion. A timeline. A shift from discussion to execution. I walked over to the window, looking out at the backyard where the grass had started to grow uneven without Robert's careful attention. "Daniel," I said, keeping my voice steady, "you were talking about selling my home less than 24 hours after that reading." "It is not about timing," he said, a hint of impatience creeping in now. "It is about moving forward." Before I could respond, another sound cut in, the sharp chime of the doorbell. I turned slightly, glancing toward the front hall. "Someone is at the door," I said. "I will call you back." "Mom, wait," he started, but I had already ended the call. I walked down the hallway, my steps measured, and opened the front door. A man stood there in a navy blazer, holding a leather portfolio under his arm. Behind him, parked at the curb, was a white SUV with a real estate logo on the side. "Mrs. Harper?" he asked with a polite smile. "I am Tom Jenkins with Lakeview Realty. I spoke with Claire yesterday. She asked me to stop by and take a preliminary look at the property." For a moment, I simply looked at him. Not because I did not understand what he was saying, but because of how quickly everything had been set into motion. Claire had not just planned this. She had scheduled it. "You spoke with Claire?" I repeated. "Yes, ma'am," he said, flipping open his portfolio to a page with notes. "She mentioned you would be expecting me this morning, so we could start discussing listing options. I just need about 20 minutes to walk through the house." I held the door frame lightly with one hand, grounding myself in something solid. Then I smiled, not out of politeness, but out of clarity. "Mr. Jenkins," I said, "I am afraid there has been a misunderstanding." He blinked, caught slightly off guard. "Oh, this house is not being listed today," I continued, "and no one is walking through it without my permission." His smile faltered just enough to reveal uncertainty. "I understand," he said carefully, "but I was told, you were told by someone who does not live here." I interrupted, still calm. "So I suggest you call Claire back and confirm that before you waste any more of your time." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Of course. I apologize for the inconvenience." I stepped back just enough to close the door, the latch clicking into place with quiet finality. For a moment, I stood there in the hallway, listening to his footsteps retreat down the porch, the car door opening, the engine starting. Then I turned and walked back into the living room, my gaze moving over the furniture, the photographs, the small details that made this place mine. Claire had not just smiled in that conference room. She had moved ahead, already acting as if the outcome was unquestionable, already bringing strangers to my door to measure what she believed was hers. I picked up my phone again, this time not to call Daniel, but to scroll through my contacts until I found another number, one I had not needed in years. Robert's old financial advisor, a man who had handled our accounts long before Daniel ever took an interest in them. My thumb hovered for a brief second, then pressed the call button. If Claire was accelerating this process, then so would I. Because the moment she sent that realtor to my door without asking me, she made one thing very clear. This was no longer just about a document. It was about control, and I was not going to give it up without finding out exactly how she thought she had already won. He answered on the second ring, his voice steady in a way that immediately took me back 10 years, to a time when decisions were made carefully, not rushed through with quiet pressure. "Evelyn," he said, "it has been a while. What can I do for you?" I walked slowly into Robert's study as I spoke, closing the door behind me out of habit, the way we used to when we needed to discuss something important. The room still smelled faintly of old paper and aftershave, and the desk sat exactly as he had left it, except now I saw it differently. Not as a place of memories, but as a place that might still hold answers. "I need to ask you something about Robert's estate," I said. "Specifically, whether he ever mentioned changing his will in the last few months before he passed." There was no hesitation this time. "No," he replied. "In fact, we had the opposite conversation." I stopped mid-step. "What do you mean?" "About 6 months before he died," he continued, "he reviewed everything. He was very clear, Evelyn. He said he wanted you fully protected. The house, the accounts, everything structured so you would not have to rely on anyone." I rested my hand on the back of Robert's chair, gripping it just enough to steady myself. "So there was no amendment?" I asked. "Not through me," he said, "and I would have been involved if there were. Robert did not make those kinds of decisions alone." I let that settle for a moment, then lowered my voice slightly. "Then I need your help," I said, "because there is a document being presented as an amendment, and it does not align with what you are telling me." There was a brief silence on the line, followed by a shift in his tone, more focused now. "Do you have a copy?" "I do." "Good. Do not confront anyone yet," he said. "If this is what I think it is, you need to move carefully. There are ways to verify authenticity, paper trail, filing records, even the sequence of account changes tied to it." I glanced down at the desk, at the old leather blotter where Robert used to sign checks, and then at the drawers beneath it. "What should I look for first?" I asked. "Start with access," he replied. "Who had the opportunity to introduce that document?" And check any changes in your financial accounts around that same time. If someone altered the will, they likely made other moves to support it. I thanked him and ended the call, setting the phone down gently on the desk. The room felt quieter than before, but not empty. There was direction now. I moved around to the side of the desk and pulled open the top drawer. Inside were the things Robert kept within reach: pens, envelopes, a small stack of unopened mail. Beneath that, another drawer. This one required a slight tug, as if it had not been opened in a while. When it slid free, I found a thin stack of documents tucked neatly in the back corner. Bank statements, account summaries. I pulled them out and set them on the desk, flipping through the pages one by one. At first, everything looked ordinary. Monthly balances, routine withdrawals. But then I saw it. A series of transfers, all dated within the same week, 3 months ago. Each one was small enough not to draw attention on its own, but together they formed a pattern. Funds moved from one account to another, then into a newly opened account I did not recognize. I leaned closer, reading the details more carefully. The new account was listed under a joint name: Daniel Harper and Claire Harper. I exhaled slowly, not in shock, but in confirmation of something that had been forming since yesterday. They had not just changed a document. They had started moving pieces into place. I reached for my phone again and took a photo of the statements, then another, making sure every number was clear. This was no longer about what I felt or what I suspected. This was about records, actions, a timeline that could be traced. I closed the drawer and stood there for a moment, looking around the study one more time, at the life Robert and I had built, at the systems he had trusted, at the order he believed would protect me. And for the first time since that meeting, I felt the balance shift. Not completely, but enough to change the direction of what came next. Because if they had already moved money in addition to presenting that document, then this was not a single act. It was a sequence. Planned, timed, quietly executed. I picked up my phone again, this time opening the security app connected to the house, the one Robert had installed years ago, but I rarely checked. My finger hovered over the activity log for the week Daniel and Claire had visited. If I could confirm exactly when they entered the house, when they accessed certain rooms, then I would not just have a theory. I would have a timeline that matched everything else. And as I tapped the screen and waited for the log to load, one thought settled in with absolute clarity. Whatever they had done that afternoon, they had not expected me to look this closely, and that was exactly why I was going to find it. The activity log did not take long to load, but what it showed changed everything. I stood there in Robert's study, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting a narrow circle of light across the screen, and scrolled slowly through the entries. Front door access. Back door access. Motion detected in the hallway. Each timestamp lined up neatly in sequence until I reached the date I had been looking for. Tuesday, 3 months ago, the day Daniel and Claire had come over. At 1:14 p.m., the system recorded the front door opening. That matched what I remembered. At 1:36 p.m., there was motion detected in the hallway, again, consistent with them walking through the house. But then I saw something that made me stop scrolling. At 1:52 p.m., the system logged a second entry at the front door. Not an exit, an entry. I frowned slightly and tapped the line to expand the details. The code used was not mine. It was not Daniel's either. It was listed as a temporary access code, one that had been created that same morning at 9:08 a.m. I did not move right away. I simply stared at the screen, letting the information settle into place. Someone else had entered my home that afternoon. Not a neighbor, not a delivery driver. Someone with a code that had been deliberately created for that specific day. I set the phone down on the desk and reached for the chair, lowering myself into it slowly. The leather creaked beneath me, the same familiar sound Robert used to make when he sat there balancing the checkbook. "All right," I said quietly to the empty room. "Let us see who you invited." I picked up the phone again and tapped into the settings menu, navigating to the section that stored access credentials. The temporary code had a label attached to it. Not a name, exactly, just an initial. LC. I read it once, then again, my mind already making the connection before I fully allowed it. Linda Carver. The notary whose name appeared on the document. The notary who had just told me she had never set foot in my house. I felt a shift then, not in my surroundings, but in the structure of what I understood. This was no longer a question of whether something had been altered. This was evidence that someone had been brought into my home under controlled access, at a time when I was in the kitchen, unaware, trusting the two people walking through my hallway. I stood up again, this time with purpose, and walked out of the study toward the kitchen. The memory came back sharper now, no longer vague. The low voices. The moment when Daniel had asked me if I needed anything from the store, encouraging me to stay where I was. The brief sound of the front door opening that I had dismissed at the time, assuming one of them had stepped out for a phone call. I reached the kitchen counter and placed both hands on the cool surface, grounding myself in something solid and real. You had someone else here, I said aloud, the words steady, not emotional. And you made sure I did not see them. The timeline was no longer theoretical. At 1:52 p.m., a third person entered the house using a code created that same morning. Claire had arrived with a bag. Daniel had asked about the safe. And somewhere between those two actions, a document had been introduced, signed, or replaced. I picked up my phone again and scrolled back to the contact for Linda Carver. My thumb hovered for a moment before pressing call. She answered more quickly this time. Miss Carver, I said, I need to ask you something very specific. Of course, she replied. Were you in Naperville on the afternoon of March 12th? There was a pause, longer than before. No, she said. I told you, I was in law that day. What? I turned slightly, looking down the hallway toward the front door, as if I could still see the moment it opened 3 months ago. Because someone entered my house that afternoon using a code labeled with your initials, I said. Silence followed, heavy and unmistakable. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. That is not possible, she said. I do not even know where you live. I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them again, sharper now. Then someone wanted it to look like you did, I replied. I ended the call before she could respond further and set the phone down slowly. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were aligning. Claire had arranged the realtor. Daniel had avoided my questions. A notary had been referenced without ever being present. And now there was proof that someone, using her initials, had been brought into my house at the exact time this amendment was supposedly executed. I walked back toward the study, my steps more certain than before. The balance had shifted. Not completely, but enough. Because this was no longer just about suspicion or interpretation. This was a constructed event with a controlled entry, a false identity, and a document that did not match its own record. And if they had gone this far to make it look legitimate, then the question was no longer whether they had done something wrong. The question was who that third person really was, and what they were willing to risk to keep me from finding out. By late afternoon, they stopped pretending. I was in the living room, sitting in Robert's old armchair with the bank statements spread neatly across the coffee table, when I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Not one car. Two. I did not rush to the window. I already knew who it would be. The front door opened without a knock. That alone told me everything I needed to know about how far they believed this had already gone. Mom, Daniel called out, his voice echoing lightly through the hallway. We came by to talk. I remained where I was, letting them come to me. A few seconds later, they stepped into the living room together. Claire was carrying a slim folder tucked under her arm, the same kind real estate agents use for listing presentations. Daniel looked tense, but not uncertain. That flicker I had seen in his eyes yesterday was gone. In its place was something more settled, more decided. You should have told me you were sending people to my house, I said calmly, before either of them could begin. Claire did not apologize. She set the folder down on the coffee table with deliberate care. We are on a timeline, Evelyn, she said. The market is moving quickly, and we do not want to miss the window. I glanced down at the folder, then back up at her. You do not get to decide that, I replied. Daniel stepped forward slightly, placing his hands on his hips. Legally, we do, he said. The will is clear. There it was again. That word. Legally. Clean. Final. As if repeating it would make it true. I leaned back in the chair, studying both of them for a moment before speaking again. Then why are you here? I asked. If everything is so clear, why not just proceed without me? Claire's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile this time, but something close. Because it will be easier if you cooperate, she said. For everyone. She opened the folder and turned it toward me. Inside were printed pages, comparative listings, estimated market values, a proposed timeline for staging and showings. One page had a handwritten note at the top, target list date, next Friday. I picked it up, scanning it briefly, then set it back down exactly where she had placed it. You have planned this very thoroughly, I said. Of course, she replied. We did not want to leave anything to chance. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, glancing between us. Mom, look, he said, softening his tone just a little. This does not have to be difficult. We will make sure you are comfortable. We have already looked at a few senior communities nearby. There is one about 10 miles from here with great amenities. I turned my head slowly to look at him. You have already looked? I asked. He hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Just options, he said. Nothing is decided yet. I let that settle in the room, the implication of it hanging there between us. They had not just planned to take the house. They had planned where I would go afterward. Without asking me, without even telling me. I stood up then, smoothing my coat lightly with my hands, and walked past them toward the hallway. I need a glass of water, I said. It was not an excuse. It was a pause. In the kitchen, I filled a glass from the sink and took a slow sip, giving myself just enough time to think through what came next. When I returned to the living room, they were still standing there, waiting, confident in the direction this was going. All right, I said, setting the glass down on the side table. If this is how you want to proceed, then we should do it properly. Claire's eyes sharpened slightly. What do you mean? She asked. I met her gaze directly. I mean we should have another meeting, I said. With Mr. Reeves. With all the documents. Every version. Every record. If I am going to leave this house, I want to understand exactly how it happened. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Claire. It was brief, but I caught it. Not fear. Not yet. But something closer to calculation. That is not necessary, Claire said. Everything has already been reviewed. Then it should not be a problem to review it again. I replied, my tone still even. The room fell quiet for a moment. Then Daniel nodded slowly. Fine, he said. We can do that. Claire did not respond immediately, but I could see the shift in her posture, the slight tightening in her shoulders. They believed they were in control. They believed this was a formality. I picked up the folder she had brought, closed it, and handed it back to her. Next time, I said, we will go through everything together. She took it without a word. And as they turned to leave, I watched them carefully, noting the confidence in their steps, the certainty in their silence. They thought this next meeting would confirm what they had already secured. But as the front door closed behind them, I looked back at the papers on my table, the bank transfers, the access logs, the notarization record, and I understood something they did not. The next time we all sat down in that room, it would not be to accept what they had done. It would be to show them exactly where they had made their first mistake. That night, I did not sit in the living room or wander through the house the way I had the past few days. I worked. I cleared the dining table completely, wiping the surface down until it was bare, then began placing everything in order, documents on the left, notes in the center, my phone and laptop on the right. It was not just about gathering information anymore. It was about structuring it. I started with the timeline. March 12th. Daniel arrives at 1:14 p.m. Claire arrives shortly after. Temporary access code created at 9:08 a.m. Third-party entry at 1:52 p.m. I wrote each time down carefully on a legal pad, underlining the gaps between them. Then I added the financial movements. The transfers. The new joint account. I circled the dates that overlapped with the visit. It was all beginning to align in a way that did not rely on interpretation. It relied on sequence. I picked up my phone and dialed Mr. Reeves. He answered on the third ring, his voice slightly guarded. Evelyn, he said, I was expecting your call. Good, I replied. Because we are going to need more than a standard meeting this time. There was a brief pause. What do you have? He asked. I glanced down at the notes in front of me. Enough to suggest that the amendment you read yesterday may not be valid, I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The silence on the other end told me everything. That is a serious claim, he said finally. I am aware, I replied. Which is why I want a full review. Every document. Every supporting record. And I want it scheduled as soon as possible. Tomorrow afternoon, he said after a moment. 3 o'clock. Same conference room. That works, I said. Then, before ending the call, I added one more thing. And Mr. Reeves, I said, I would recommend you pull the original filing records before that meeting. Not just the copies you were given. Another pause. Longer this time. Understood, he said quietly. I ended the call and set the phone down. That was the first move. Not confrontation. Positioning. I reached for my laptop next and opened the home security system dashboard again, this time exporting the activity log as a file. I saved it, labeled it clearly, and backed it up to a small USB drive I found in Robert's desk drawer. Then I did the same with the photos of the bank statements, organizing them by date and account number. Every piece needed to stand on its own. No assumptions, no gaps, just facts. Around 9 that evening, my phone buzzed again. Claire's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring once, then answered. "Evelyn," she said, her tone composed, almost pleasant. "Daniel mentioned you want another meeting." "That is correct," I replied. "We have already been through this," she said. "I am not sure what you think will change." I leaned back slightly in my chair, looking at the neat arrangement of evidence in front of me. "Neither am I," I said. "But I would like to find out." There was a brief silence. Then she spoke again, a little more directly this time. "You are making this harder than it needs to be." "No," I said calmly. "I am making it clearer." She did not respond right away. When she did, her voice had lost a bit of its earlier softness. 3 o'clock, then," she said. "We will be there." "I know," I replied. I ended the call before she could say anything else and placed the phone back on the table. For a moment, I sat there in the quiet, looking at everything I had laid out. The documents, the timeline, the small, precise details that no one had expected me to notice. They believed I was reacting, trying to catch up, trying to understand. But that was no longer true. I was preparing. I gathered the papers into a single folder, slid the USB drive into a small envelope, and placed both into my handbag. Then I stood up and turned off the lights, leaving the dining room in darkness. Tomorrow, they would walk into that conference room expecting to confirm their control, to finalize what they had already set in motion. They would bring their version of events, their documents, their confidence, and I would let them, because the more certain they felt, the less careful they would be. And as I headed upstairs, one thought stayed with me, steady and unmistakable. I was not going into that meeting to argue about what they had done. I was going in to show them exactly when it started and who had been standing in my house when it happened. The next day at exactly 2:42 p.m., I walked into the building 10 minutes earlier than necessary, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to see who arrived before me. The lobby was quiet, the kind of polished silence that made every footstep sound deliberate. I nodded briefly to the receptionist, then took a seat where I could clearly see the elevators without being directly in front of them. My handbag rested beside me, heavier than usual, not with weight, but with purpose. At 2:51 p.m., the elevator doors opened, and Daniel stepped out first, followed by Claire. She was dressed more formally than the day before, a structured blazer, her hair pulled back neatly, as if this were already a closing rather than a discussion. Daniel glanced around the lobby, then spotted me. There was a flicker of surprise that he quickly smoothed over. "You are early," he said as they approached. "So are you," I replied. Claire gave me a small, controlled smile. "It is important to be prepared," she said. "I agree," I answered. We rode the elevator up together in silence, the same mirrored walls reflecting 3 versions of the same moment. Only this time, I was no longer the one catching up. When we entered the conference room, Mr. Reeves was already there, standing beside the table with a different set of folders than the day before. Thicker, organized. He looked up as we walked in, his expression measured but noticeably more serious. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "I have pulled the original filing records, as requested." Claire's posture shifted slightly at that, subtle but unmistakable. "Original records?" she asked. "I thought everything had already been reviewed." "We are reviewing it again," I said calmly, taking my seat at the same place as before. I set my handbag on the table, but I did not open it yet. Not immediately. Mr. Reeves gestured toward the documents in front of him. "There are a few discrepancies I would like to clarify," he said, specifically regarding the notarization and the filing timeline. Daniel frowned slightly. "What kind of discrepancies?" he asked. I watched him carefully as he spoke, noting the way his fingers tightened briefly against the edge of the table. Mr. Reeves adjusted his glasses and opened the top folder. "The amendment that was presented yesterday appears to have been submitted without a corresponding entry in the county filing system at the time it was dated," he said, "which raises questions about when it was actually processed." Claire leaned forward just enough to engage, her voice calm but firm. "Documents are sometimes filed later than they are signed," she said. "That is not unusual." "That is correct," Mr. Reeves replied. However, in this case, there is no record of submission under Robert Harper's name until much later, and even then, it is incomplete. The room grew quieter. Not tense yet, but no longer certain. I reached into my handbag then and placed a single sheet of paper on the table, the notarization record I had found in the safe. Perhaps this will help, I said. Claire's eyes moved to the paper immediately. Daniel leaned in slightly, reading it. Mr. Reeves took it and scanned the details. This lists Linda Carver as the notary, he said. Yes, I replied. And she confirmed yesterday that she was not present at my home on the date listed here. Claire did not react right away. She remained still, her hands folded, her expression controlled. That does not prove anything, she said after a moment. It could be a misunderstanding. It could be, I agreed. Then I reached into my bag again and placed a second item on the table, a printed copy of the security log. But this might clarify things further, I added. Daniel's attention shifted immediately. What is that? He asked. The activity log from my home security system, I said. It shows that a temporary access code was created the morning of March 12th and that a third party entered the house at 1:52 p.m. I let that settle for a moment before continuing. The code was labeled with the initials LC. Claire's composure held, but I saw it this time. The slight tightening in her jaw, the fraction of a second where her eyes did not move. Daniel looked from the paper to her, then back again. Claire, he said, his voice no longer steady. She did not answer immediately. Mr. Reeves leaned forward, his attention fully engaged now, no longer neutral. Mrs. Harper, he said to me, are you suggesting that someone other than the listed notary was present during the signing? I met his gaze directly. I am not suggesting, I said. I am showing you that someone was. The room shifted then, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The balance that had seemed so fixed the day before was no longer stable. Claire finally spoke, her tone lower now, more controlled than confident. You are making assumptions based on incomplete information, she said. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. Instead, I placed my hand lightly on the folder still inside my handbag, the one I had not opened yet. Then let us complete it, I said. And for the first time since this began, I saw it clearly, not doubt, not hesitation, but the first real crack in the certainty they had walked in with. Because what I had placed on that table was only part of it. And as Mr. Reeves reached for the next document, and Daniel looked between us, waiting for an answer Claire had not yet given, one thing became certain. The next piece I revealed would not just raise questions. It would force one of them to finally explain what they had done. No one spoke for a moment after that. The air in the room felt tighter, as if the walls themselves were listening. I let the silence sit there, not to create tension, but because I did not need to fill it. The documents on the table were already doing that for me. Then I opened my handbag and took out the final piece I had prepared. It was not dramatic. It was not large. Just a small, rectangular USB drive inside a plain white envelope. I placed it on the table in front of Mr. Reeves. Before we continue, I said, I think you should see this. He looked at me, then at the envelope, and carefully opened it. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention fixed now, no longer divided. Claire remained still, but I noticed her hand tighten just slightly against the edge of her folder. Mr. Reeves removed the USB drive and turned toward his laptop, inserting it without another word. The screen lit up with a list of files. I had labeled them clearly. Security_log_March 12. Bank_transfers_Q1. Camera_entry_front door. He clicked on the last one. The video opened with a timestamp in the corner, March 12, 1:51 p.m. The camera angle showed the front entryway of my house, the same narrow view I had passed 1,000 times without thinking. The door was closed at first. Then, exactly as the log had recorded, it opened. Daniel appeared in frame, stepping back slightly, holding the door open. Claire stood just behind him. And then a third person walked in. A man I had never seen before. Mid-50s, dark coat, carrying a slim black case. He stepped inside without hesitation, as if he had been expected. Daniel closed the door behind him. No greeting. No introduction. Just a quiet, efficient entry. Pause it there, Mr. Reeves said, his voice lower now, more focused. The image froze. The three of them stood in the frame, caught in a moment they clearly never intended anyone else to see. Daniel's face had gone pale. "What is this?" he asked, though the answer was already in front of him. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on the screen. "That," I said, "is the moment your notary arrived at my house." Claire exhaled slowly, then leaned forward. "That is not a notary," she said quickly. "That could be anyone." "You are right," I replied. "So let us keep going." Mr. Reeves clicked play again. The footage continued. The three of them moved down the hallway, out of frame. Then, a second clip appeared automatically, the hallway camera. Same timestamp, different angle. The man followed Daniel directly toward the wall where the safe was hidden. Claire walked beside them, her hand brushing lightly against the painting as they passed, as if she already knew exactly what was behind it. "Stop," Mr. Reeves said again. The video froze mid-step. He leaned closer to the screen, then looked back at the documents on the table, then at Claire. "You said the amendment was signed in the residence," he said slowly, "with a licensed notary." Claire's composure cracked just slightly. "That does not prove he signed anything," she said. "It just shows someone walking into a house." "Then perhaps this will," I said. I reached into my handbag one last time and placed a printed bank authorization form on the table. Mr. Reeves picked it up, scanning the details. "This is a signature verification request," he said. "From the bank." "Yes," I replied. I submitted the signature from the amendment for comparison. Daniel's head snapped toward me. "You did what?" he asked. I finally looked at him then. "I verified it," I said simply. Mr. Reeves turned the page, reading the attached result. His expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. "According to this," he said, "the signature on the amendment does not match Robert Harper's verified signature on file." The words landed cleanly. No interpretation, no ambiguity, just fact. Claire did not speak. Daniel stared at the paper, then at her, then back again. "Claire," he said, his voice no longer controlled. "What is this?" She did not answer right away. For the first time, she looked at something other than the table or the documents. She looked at me, and in that look, I saw it. The realization that the version of events she had constructed was no longer holding. Mr. Reeves closed the folder slowly and folded his hands. "Based on what I am seeing," he said, "this amendment cannot be considered valid until these discrepancies are resolved. In fact, it may be subject to formal investigation." The room shifted again, but this time it was not subtle. It was final. The authority they had relied on was no longer supporting them. I sat back in my chair, not triumphant, not relieved, just steady. Because this was not the end. Not yet. Claire straightened slightly, her voice returning, quieter now, but still controlled. "You are assuming intent," she said. "There could be an explanation." I nodded once. "Then this is your opportunity to give one," I replied. And as the silence returned to the room, heavier than before, one thing became clear. The evidence was no longer a question. The only thing left was who was going to speak first. The silence did not hold. It broke. Daniel slammed his hand against the table, the sharp crack echoing off the glass walls. "What the hell is this, Claire?" he demanded, his voice rising in a way I had not heard since he was a teenager. "You told me everything was handled. You said it was legal." Claire flinched, not dramatically, but enough to show the pressure had finally reached her. "Lower your voice," she said quickly, her tone tightening. "This is not what it looks like." "Then what does it look like?" he shot back, leaning forward, his face flushed now. "Because from where I am sitting, it looks like someone forged Dad's signature and dragged me into it." I felt the word land in the room. Forged. It was no longer implied. It was spoken. Mr. Reeves did not interrupt this time. He sat back, watching, his earlier neutrality gone, replaced by a firm, professional distance. "Mrs. Harper," he said to Claire, "you need to be very clear right now. Who was the man in that video?" Claire's eyes flicked briefly toward the paused screen, then back to the table. "He is a consultant," she said. "Someone Daniel and I hired to help organize Robert's estate documents." Daniel turned to her sharply. "I never hired anyone," he said. "You told me you were handling that." Claire's composure cracked further. "Because you said you did not want to deal with it," she snapped. "You said you trusted me. I trusted you to help, not to rewrite everything," he shot back. Their voices overlapped now, no longer controlled, no longer careful. And for the first time since this began, I did not stay seated. I stood up. The chair slid back slightly behind me, the sound cutting cleanly through their argument. "Enough," I said, not loudly. but with enough force that both of them stopped. I looked at Claire directly. "You brought a stranger into my home," I said, each word steady but no longer soft. "You accessed my safe. You replaced documents. And you stood in that room yesterday and smiled while it was being read as if it were real." She opened her mouth to respond, but I did not let her. "Do not tell me this is a misunderstanding," I continued. "Do not tell me this is about organizing paperwork. You altered a legal document that determines where I live and how I survive." Daniel stepped back slightly, as if the weight of what was happening had finally caught up to him. "Claire," he said again, quieter now, but more urgent, "tell me the truth. Did you know that signature was not real?" She looked at him then, and for a moment, the control she had held so tightly slipped. "Not completely, but enough. I did what was necessary," she said. The room went still again, but this time it was different. That was not a denial. That was an admission. Daniel stared at her. "Necessary for what?" he asked. "For us," she replied, her voice firming again as if she were trying to regain ground. "For our future. That house is too much for her." The money was sitting there, untouched. I made a decision. I felt something rise in my chest then, not confusion, not disbelief, but something sharper, something that had been building quietly until now. "You made a decision," I repeated. "About my life." Mr. Reeves leaned forward again, his tone now unmistakably official. "Mrs. Harper," he said to Claire, "what you are describing is not a personal decision. It is potential fraud, and it involves estate manipulation, forged signatures, and unauthorized access." Claire's jaw tightened. "You are overreacting," she said. "No," he replied calmly. "I am not." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing once beside the table. "I did not agree to this," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "I thought." He stopped, then turned back to her. "You said everything was already signed." "Because it needed to be," she said. "You would not have done it otherwise." That was it. The line she could not take back. The moment the structure she built turned against her. I stepped forward slightly, placing my hand on the table, not for support, but to anchor what I was about to say. "This is not about what you thought was best," I said. "This is about what you did." Claire did not respond this time. She sat there, silent, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by something harder, more defensive. Mr. Reeves closed the folder in front of him with finality. "I am suspending any execution of this amendment immediately," he said, "and I will be reporting these findings to the appropriate legal authorities." The consequences were no longer theoretical. They were in motion. Daniel sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him as the reality settled in. Claire remained upright, but the space around her had shifted. She was no longer directing anything. She was responding. And as I looked at both of them, my son, who had followed without asking enough questions, and the woman who had orchestrated all of this, I understood something clearly. This was not the end of what they had done. It was the beginning of what they would now have to answer for. And as the room fell quiet again, heavier than before, one final question remained hanging in the air. When the authorities started asking questions, who would Claire decide to protect first, herself, or the man she had pulled into this with her? The consequences did not wait for weeks or months. They began before we even left that room. Mr. Reeves made one phone call while we were still seated, his voice low but firm, stepping just outside the conference room door. When he returned, his expression had changed completely. No longer cautious, no longer neutral. "This is now a formal matter," he said. "You will both need to remain available." Claire did not move. "You are making a mistake," she said, her voice steady but thinner than before. "This can be resolved privately." "No," he replied. "It cannot." 10 minutes later, there was a knock on the glass door. Not loud, not aggressive, but final. 2 officers stepped inside, dressed in plain uniforms, their presence quiet but unmistakable. Daniel stood up immediately, his chair scraping back. "What is going on?" he asked, his voice unsteady now. One of the officers spoke calmly. "We have been asked to assist regarding a reported financial and document fraud matter." Claire remained seated for a second longer, then slowly stood. "This is unnecessary," she said. "There has been a misunderstanding." The officer met her gaze without raising his voice. "Ma'am, we are going to need you to come with us so we can ask a few questions." Daniel turned to her, his face pale, confusion now fully replaced by realization. "Claire," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "what did you do?" She did not answer him. Not this time. Instead, she reached for her bag with controlled movements. But I could see it now. The precision was gone. The certainty she had carried into that room had collapsed under the weight of facts she could not undo. As the officers guided her toward the door, she finally looked back at me. Not with apology, not with regret, but with something sharper, something resentful, as if I had taken something from her that she believed she deserved. I held her gaze without speaking. There was nothing left to say to her. The door closed behind them, and the room fell into a silence that felt entirely different from before. Not tense, not uncertain, settled. Daniel stood there for a moment, staring at the space where she had been, then slowly sank back into his chair, his hands covering his face. "I did not know," he said quietly. "I swear to you, I did not know." I watched him, taking in the weight of what had just happened. The man who had sat across from me with quiet confidence the day before now looked like someone who had just realized how far things had gone without him truly understanding them. "You did not ask," I said. My voice was not harsh, but it was not soft either. He lowered his hands and looked at me, his eyes searching for something. Understanding, forgiveness, anything that might steady him. "I thought she was handling it," he said. "I thought." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. I nodded once. "That is the problem," I replied. Mr. Reeves gathered the documents on the table, stacking them carefully. "The original will remain in full effect," he said. "Mrs. Harper, all assets revert to you as intended." The words landed clearly, without complication. The house, the accounts, everything that had been taken in that room the day before was returned just as cleanly. But this time, there was no uncertainty attached to it. I reached for my handbag and stood up, adjusting the strap on my shoulder. Daniel stood as well, as if unsure whether to follow me or stay where he was. "Mom," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of everything it had carried before. "Please, can we talk about this?" I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, not as the boy I had raised, but as the man who had allowed someone else to make decisions about my life without question. "There is nothing to talk about right now," I said. "You have your answers." He nodded slowly, the weight of that settling in. I turned and walked toward the door, my steps steady, my posture unchanged. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched across. The city, the same way it had the day before, but everything felt different. Not lighter, not easier, just clear. I stepped out onto the sidewalk and took a breath, the cool air sharp against my skin. Behind me, everything that had been constructed to push me out had collapsed under its own weight. And ahead of me, there was no uncertainty left about where I stood. I was not the one being removed. I was the one who remained. And this time, nothing, and no one, was going to take that from me again.